Morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar being run by the South African Chamber of Commerce. I'm Sharon Constanson. I'm the chairman of the South African Chamber of Commerce and I'd like to welcome you to our event. This is a series of events that we're going to be running between now, this is our first, until COP26 program that will be rolling out in Glasgow in November, and we'll be having something around that period of time as well. So this is the first, and we've picked probably a more difficult topic to have done it in, is ESG within the financial services sector, which people say, well, really, why? And hopefully John's going to demystify that for us. Please bear in mind that today is under Chatham House rule, but notwithstanding that, we are recording and there will be a recording available afterwards for those that have unfortunately not going to be able to make it, which seems to be a habit these days where half the people who register arrive and the other half hopefully do find the appropriate time to listen to the webinars. The logistics in terms of how today is going to run, we've got a one-on-one conversation that we'll be having with John. You have got all the opportunity to put in your questions, put them in right from the beginning. I might pick some of your questions instead of mine during the conversation, but definitely from about 1:45 in 45 minutes, we'll be switching to your questions rather than mine. But it's for us to share knowledge and to get an understanding and an appreciation of the importance of ESG within our financial services sector and the way banking is working today. So you've got two South Africans sharing their knowledge, hopefully, and we'll look forward to a productive time together. So I'd also like to just introduce you to John. Known John for quite a long time now, fellow South African, and he's founded a business that is in the financial services sector, consulting and advising and providing professional services to the different banking and financial services organizations within the UK. He, from a strategic point of view, is where he brings the value to the organizations he works with, but most importantly, like us all South Africans, is you want to touch and feel the results. You actually want to deliver something constructive and real and meaningful, and John fits into that category as well. He's a thought leader and advisor to boards and CEOs, so he's operating at the C-suite level, helping boards actually to get this place that the market has moved to, where the expectations of where boards must be. And it's taking a lot of organizations. I work with the FTSE 250, FTSE 100. These guys are, and SMEs, the lot, are all really working hard to try and get to absorb what this means to their business, how they can individually make a difference. So this is John's space. He helps boards get their mind around it, their ribs around this, so that they can be adding value. As you said, sustainability is not about biology, but by the choices people make. And I think COVID has shown to us how actually decisions that were forced upon us, that we would never in a million years have taken willingly and initially of our own free will, has taken a global change and made a huge difference to the carbon footprint, the climate change, the quality of our air. Yeah, so many things have improved in this year that we've all been working from home. I think the homes are taking strain, the offices and the cities are not. So the strains have all moved their places and where they are. So I would like to take this opportunity to welcome John to the presentation. John, thank you for joining us today and starting off this ESG series that we're going to be running. And one of the things I wanted to just start with is both coming from South Africa and having spent so much of my time in Hermanus, right on the water, and you've got that mountain behind you that literally goes up in flames at least once every 5 years. And we all talk about the regenerative value that that fire brings and however frightening it is at the time, we know it is doing something else that is positive as well. So why don't we start with that as to what is the value and the regeneration cycle that occurs with something like fire?
Absolutely, Sharon, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to, as you say, share some of the passion and the purpose and the pride in this very important focus area, and as you rightly say, the current situation with COVID-19 has really exacerbated the importance of understanding, the impacts of ESG and what we need to do. The climate emergency, I mean, people use that terminology quite a lot, but it's a lot more than that. So, the subject is an all-encompassing one, and it's a very, very large subject. So really good to be able to bring the banking element. I'm a banker for 30 years, and know and understand, how that industry needs to react to some of the challenges that we face. So what I'll do is, if that's all right, I'll share a screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. As I said, thank you, Sharon, for for allowing me this platform. I think the important thing is to bring to the fore the fact that we need to understand what resources, what challenges lie ahead, and how to re-establish the word trust. And I tend to use the word trust with a degree of trepidation, because again, it's quite an all-encompassing one. We've gone through that. So just a bit of an introduction myself. Sorry, shaky there. Again, I've been in the industry a long time, as Sharon's given in the introduction. For me, it's really understanding people's behaviours and changing choices people make. And of course, as Sharon's alluded to, a proud South African. I grew up in the Western Cape. I grew up in Cape Town, so I'm a little bit closer to home to what Sharon's saying. But sorry, let's get that. The agenda today is really introduction to the technical and practical meaning of responsible banking. And I think it's quite important that we understand the definition of responsible banking, and the challenges that are facing the industry. And of course, the industry is very much driven by consumer preferences and demands. And as we know, consumers are effectively demanding more. There's greater transparency in where the investments are being held, and therefore people are starting to ask more questions. And again, putting financial institutions to the challenge. Detangling the many faces of ESG again is an important aspect, because, as I alluded to earlier, it's a very, very big subject, and really just the tip of the iceberg. So it's not something that today I can cover absolutely everything. We're focusing in on the E side of ESG, and I think that's really where the key focus is on at the moment. And in terms of getting to that point, I mean, Sharon's alluded to beautiful Hermanus, a lovely part of South Africa, but we have a vegetation that is common to that area and common to the slopes of Table Mountain as well. You'll see Table Mountain in the background, known as fynbos, a Hans word that actually alludes to the thickness of the stem. So it's a bush that is quite thin. Fyn is fine, as by definition, and really requires, let's say, a fire to rejuvenate and grow again. As Sharon's alluded to, it's something that is actually required before you're going to get growth. Of course, our national flower of South Africa is the protea. You see it in the top picture there. We want that to rejuvenate and continue to grow. That's the good side. There is an element of bad side. Again, you would have seen in the news, California is an area that gets this quite significantly due to its climate, etc., etc. But that's the damaging aspect. That is where you don't want it to happen. And unfortunately, we're seeing it more and more. It's beginning to become a regular occurrence. If it's not in terms of fires, it's in terms of floods in parts of the world that you wouldn't actually expect. So our climate is definitely changing, and it's changing for the worse in terms of what we're doing to the planet. So we're sitting in a situation that we have to do something. It's not an option anymore. So really, just moving on to understanding the banking side, and then we'll move back to more the elements of where I think things have gone wrong. Responsible banking, again, 3 elements that I want to bring out. Again, the word responsible can be understood in very different ways, but I think the 3 elements that I want to draw out is it's looking to the future. Again, as there's an understanding that we need to fix what we've done in the past, but really it's future and forward looking. I think that's a key fundamental. We can't actually go back and fix some of the activities within the sector. We just need to look to the future and see how we're going to make those changes. Contribution to society, again, a big element of that, as I've alluded to in the beginning, there is a greater degree of transparency around what contribution the banking sector is making. As most people understand, it's a relatively successful sector in the United Kingdom. Covers a huge market area, and therefore an understanding and a belief that you're going to make a contribution to society is fundamental. But of course, you can't just do that without any sort of incentive. And I think an alignment of business strategy to society's goals. We set goals as a society. We have an expectation, but we need to ensure that there's a business element to that to create that incentive for people to do things to operate. So very important to bring out the fact that, in my opinion, banking is slowly moving to a more understanding of what society is wanting.
And in what way is it adapting to that, John? What sort of things are people doing differently at the board level with the sea of change that's occurring? How are they responding?
So
I think your next slide might have some of it on.
No problem at all, Sharon. I think where the response has been is the fact that, as I said, people are starting to ask more questions. There is a greater degree of accepted responsibility in terms of some of the investments being made. The pension industry is a significant one, and is starting to understand that sort of long-term expectation that you need to be doing the right thing. So where you've got investments that are, let's say, very much driven by investing in coal-fired power stations, as a quite a well-used example, that acceptance of that is becoming less agreeable to society as a whole. We have a huge challenge in terms of some of the parts of the world where survival is the minimum, and there isn't that expectation that people that's either survival or lighting a fire and putting carbon into the atmosphere. The choices are not really there. But I think to answer your question, people are really starting to challenge the norm. Whereas in the past it was an accepted, you handed your investments and your pension and your funds across to a pension administrator, an investment company, whatever the case, and you kind of expected to retire at 65 whenever, and you get a pension and live happily ever after. Well, actually, there's a greater degree of questioning what that investment is doing and where it's going.
So that is coming from the owner of the original funds that have been given for investment. And where do you find the banks, the people in the pension funds themselves, but also people in where they're investing into? How are they joining this journey of accepting that this is actually really, really important? Because I'm seeing still in some of the organizations I'm working with, I'm seeing those that embrace it fully, but also I come across those that are still saying, but I can't make a difference, and therefore why is it important?
I think the challenges are three-dimensional. I think the important thing, you need to have a degree of governance around this and regulation. And although I'm not one to shout regulation from the top of Table Mountain, because I'll probably get arrested, but the situation is that you need an overall umbrella regulation and a body that is going to push and put it into some sort of cohesive framework. I'm going to show a little bit later in the presentation the challenges that presents. The other aspect is that there isn't a degree of understanding at board level in terms of what a proper ESG strategy looks like. We did a survey in 2019. I tried to avoid 2020 for obvious reasons, because nothing was normal. But they did a survey in 2019 to gauge the level of board member understanding of what an ESG policy and strategy would look like. And across the piece, this was about just under 1,000 boards, between 2 and 6% board members actually fully understood what an ESG policy and strategy would look like. So there's quite a long way to go in
Long
terms
way
of
to go.
getting people to drive strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And the third element is asset allocation. And that's where
Right.
the private sector can drive the demand, because if there isn't the demand, there's not going to be the supply. And we need to change that ideology. I just read this morning, actually, in the news, that looking at ESG performance ratings, you've got an uplift of ESG over 3 years of at least 2% more than what the benchmark rates have been producing over a period of time. So it is starting to change. The incentives are there because the returns are looking fairly healthy. These days we don't look at double-digit figures without looking and questioning them, because the world's in quite a stressed state. But so that getting those three dimensions right and putting them into a cohesive framework, I think, is fundamental.
Mm-hmm. There's a graph you're showing on a page or two further on, which you'll probably get to in a moment. I was doing some work with a client the other day, and we had a graph that looked almost exactly the same. It sort of started low and ended up high. That one next to the bar chart, right, sort of right in the middle. That you were talking about assets a moment ago, and the exponential change that is occurring. Maybe you can share some of this very interesting information with us.
Very much so. I mean, I think the message here is of massive growth, and maybe just to take one step back, Sharon, just to lead into that one. I think the important is to understand that the principles around the United Nations and bringing the principles into a framework. So this has now got headline news. It's become a lot more visible. It tends to do that because, obviously, I mean, Al Gore in the early days, but you've got the book that's just been launched by Bill Gates, driving greenhouse gas emissions. A very good book. I actually just started it a couple of days ago. Very much from the soul. He runs a foundation with his wife that is very proactive in this area. And what I like about even the start of the book is that it takes it down to simple level. It's a simple understanding of manufacturing cement, for example, and how you do that better. But the understanding here is the fact that it's a relatively new principle involvement, and the PRI has actually been around for a period of time, but was only really sort of launched in 2019 in all seriousness, because I think the climate agreement 2015 brought a lot of things forward where people now are starting to be held to account. And of course, the wheels of change do take a relatively long period, but this was launched in 2019. Go the other way. But actually, with Kofi Annan, and just I'll put this one in here because just want to sort of emphasize the fact that the PRI, so the specific principles, are not actually that new. That this is a 2006 launch in New York of the principles, but it didn't have any framework. It didn't have any big ticket push and big body understanding of having the resources to be able to do it. So very very prominent event, but it really needed that push. From a commitment perspective, again, it's driving an understanding that this is what we say we're going to do. But I think the important thing is to actually do what you say you're going to do, and that's really where the challenge is. So getting back to looking at the market. The market is one of the drivers. My third dimension, where the growth in investments in this area has actually become quite phenomenal. I think that's really where this gets the attraction of the market, because the demand is saying we want to invest in more ESG related products, want better understanding of what this is doing in terms of where those funds are going, and effectively how the funds are being used. We see quite a lot on television where we're building wind farms and we're solar farms and it's all good stuff. But actually, there's two aspects here. The first aspect is we need to repair the damage we've already done. And the other aspect is that we need to stop putting so much into the atmosphere that's creating that warmth. So it's not just, stopping driving your motor car down the street, because that's not going to happen, and that takes a long period of time. And if you talk to somebody who's on a moped scooter in far parts of the world that have less advanced than ourselves, and you ask him to stop, get off his motor scooter and start walking, when he actually needs to get to work to be able to put food on the table, it's quite a difficult ask. I'm just using that one as an example. But so yeah, fundamental shift in terms of what the market is demanding. Two aspects again. Europe has been particularly active in this regard. Nordic countries are very far ahead in investment. A lot of the Canadians, Canadian big pension funds out in Canada are moving massive investments into this area. So the US is starting to wake up again, notwithstanding obviously the change of an administration and bringing that to the fore, because Biden has very clearly put the climate challenge back on the agenda. And again, fantastic that as you say, we're leading to COP26. COP26 at the end of this year in Glasgow, and the challenges that we face, I think, is really going to be, now we've been going for a period of time. What are the actual actions that you're going to take? This is one of them, like driving the market to create increased investment spend and therefore opportunity.
And how would I, as an investor, feel comfortable that this information you're giving me is accurate? Because we all know statistics, lies, and statistics, I think is how the saying goes. You can look at things like this and you know that reporting in annual reports, ESG statements, governance statements, all these things can have a degree of expectation even written into them. They don't, but how do we be absolutely sure that we are being given the truth about where our investments are, and how is that whole supply chain down to the bottom end evidenced back to the pension fund or whoever else it is who is investing my money? How does that all work?
Absolutely fantastic question, which really leads me on to the challenge that we face in terms of data. And I was talking to a senior member of Schroders a couple of days ago, and talking about the challenges that we have in terms of data transparency. What I've tried to do there in the slide is to bring forward the fact that you've got multiple suppliers. I mean, there are literally thousands of data providers out there that are trying to sell a product. There's obviously nothing wrong with that, but it's a bit daunting to the average person in the street. And this is really what we need to get that across, is that people need to be able to understand what they're being shown, and have that trust, as you rightly put it. So it's not just about the number of suppliers out there, but also how the data is used, how it is communicated, and how it's broken down. And this is early days. You've got some big suppliers out there that are being able to bring forward the kind of offerings that they have in terms of portfolios. But ESG is not just one number. It can never be one number. It's too bigger topic and number of sectors that would be involved. So you can't just really bring it down to individuals. We tend to find that more seems to be better, when actually it's the exact opposite, in my opinion. If you look at Barclays' corporate social responsibility report, it goes to over 350 pages. So
that's using up a lot of paper.
Exactly. Although they do claim it to be sustainable. But the point is that these days, when we buy a mobile phone, we don't read all the documentation. Hence the reason why they have a quick start guide normally in the package, if there is still a piece of paper in the package. But people just don't really want to be inundated with data. More is not better. It's the quality of the data, not the quantity. And yes, there's a huge way to go again to answer your question in terms of trust and understanding. It's really wanting to bring some sort of cohesiveness to the market.
Mhm.
They have a standard framework, have a standard approach, have something that people can do a comparison to. Because at the moment,
Mhm.
you've got nothing to compare against. So there's no benchmark that people have a degree of trust in.
I know that your data and the way you've displayed it is better for me than the way somebody else has displayed it. It's a very difficult journey that we're going on to.
Hmm.
You make a statement about us not wanting to think like we must stop thinking like bankers. What is all that about?
I mean, historically, bankers have thought about profit. Profit has been a fundamental.
Okay.
It's the core elements of it. It's how much money we can make. I actually allude to some of at the end of the presentation some quite good books that have been written for people that have been in the front line. Makes interesting reading if you have the time. But effectively, it's very much driven by profit. So that was the key goal. I was part of that. For me, I was working with Bob Cap and Bob Diamond. I always put Bob Diamond's picture on the front there just to remind myself of some good days and some bad days. And I am guilty of chasing the return, seeing how much the bonus would be in February and all of that. So really, very interesting to believe that there is a complete difference. It's the people becoming more important than the profit. Importantly, as you've alluded to, is stop thinking like bankers and more like human beings.
I come from a background where I'm a trader. So either you have people who are pit traders, people who've been electronic traders, whether they've been commodities or whether they've been currencies and all the various other traders that exist in the market. Their purpose is to buy and sell for a profit. Where does the ESG come into their psyche within a banking or an investment bank environment?
I think the first challenge that you have is that you've focused in there on the word transaction. So that is a transaction. Yes. That is a one-off. It happens. It's you have a demand, a supply, a price, and you have a contract of some sort. That can be whatever it is. ESG is not transactional. It can't be. It's a belief and a behavior of changing the way that we do things. So thinking outside in terms of the margin that you've made on that particular transaction is something that we need to dispel very quickly. I'm not saying that it needs to go completely out the window, so to speak, because as I briefly alluded to in the beginning, you need to create that incentive for people to do something. If you don't create that incentive, you're going to have a real challenge in terms of people moving from a position A to a position and hopefully better position B. And it's really starting to think like human beings.
And correlating to that, I would say it's also, you talk about incentivization. Your other side of that coin or part of it is in our code, our corporate governance code, we talk about long-term sustainability of a business. The other aspect is we need to look at the long-term sustainability of our planet. And that's what thinking like humans is, trying to balance those two. Now, if we don't have long-term sustainability of a business, we're not going to have long-term sustainability of the planet. So is this where boards are sitting with this conundrum of, yes, we have to be profitable and we have to be successful, and we have to be long-term sustainable, and I have to consider all my stakeholders, and you asking me to 100% focus on the planet, you get some senior people that are finding that conundrum difficult to work out what is right and what is for the business, for the investor, and all the other different stakeholders. What's the sort of conversations you've had with some of your customers in this space?
I mean, effectively, and you're right. It's a real understanding and being able to balance the situations with respect that you need to create a return element, because that's without that, it's going to be very difficult to convince people to make changes. We also need to expand upon the situation in terms of what you're doing as an organization in terms of moving in a different direction. I'll give again, example from the South African scenarios that we still burn a huge amount of coal to generate energy, and effectively that's what it boils down to: the generation of energy. I mean, in South Africa's some will know, we have load shedding, we have a real power challenge, that's been ongoing for a while. It tends to sort of come and go in phases, but South Africa has and still has a huge quantity of low-grade carbon or coal in the ground, which they can burn in coal-fired power stations to generate energy. That kind of thinking needs to change, and it's really being able to put the data in front of senior people and saying, this is the kind of investment that your funds and your capital is allocated to. I've got an asset manager in obviously not going to mention names, but they are currently moving their portfolio completely out of coal. They're not even going to even think about coal investments going forward, because it's a fundamental change to believing that there are better ways of generating energy. And banking the same, right? Banking's been around for a long time. We have brilliant people on the planet. Look at the scale and the speed of putting a vaccine in place. Normally takes 10 years. We've got a vaccine in sort of 10 months. We have that ability as human beings, and really being able to sort of move people out of that sort of, as you say, the balancing the idea that you need to always have a return, when actually that you do, but you need to be able to invest that return in something that's going to make it more sustainable, because we're only on this planet for a short period.
I know.
we do need to save it for future generations, and that's the fundamental of that.
It's interesting, I notice in governments as well that do a lot of development, finance development, investment in infrastructure. Some of the big infrastructure creations that are occurring within Africa, for example, and I'm talking about the greater Africa, not South Africa specifically. And it's interesting how the governments are saying that they are not going to fund anything that is coal-fired anymore. And yet you've got countries where that is all they've got. But then you look at the place, you think they are sitting with more sun, more wind, and more water than anywhere else. And it's changing the mindsets right down at that basic level, that you don't have to dig it out the ground to burn it. It's other ways that you can get it. So it is a long-term fundamental change.
Absolutely, and it's the use and embracing technology to be able to bring that forward. I mean, Bill Gates does sort of reference the fact that you're not going to change people overnight. For a start, I think is a very real point. It's not going to just switch on something that's going to go completely in the green direction. There's an element of greenwashing out there. It's a term
Yes.
term is used quite a lot.
What I was alluding to without using the words.
Yeah. There's as I said, a lot of talk, a lot of people sort of only looking at one of those dimensions, but bringing that social impact aspect into it. I mean, the biggest polluters are the wealthiest countries, just because of their pure logical connection with industrialization and economic activity. The US and China, etc., are huge, huge polluters of the atmosphere. Some other areas that you don't actually that you're quite surprised about are major polluters, but don't really get as much attention because for a number of different political reasons. But it's governments can say let's not build any more coal-fired power stations and therefore we're not. But the private sector need to embrace that, because it's the private sector that is going to be the push to doing different things. The government are not going to be there they can assist, but they're not going to be the final decision makers in terms of some of the changes that need to take place. And for me, it's really getting that sort of human aspect, as I alluded to there earlier, just to sort of say that we've been doing this for a long time, right? The first bank was an Italian bank in Siena, and going back to 1472. We've been banking for years. The oldest bank in the United Kingdom is actually a bank that operates today. You don't actually see it on the high street. 1672. Over 300 years we're doing banking. I do smile actually in this particular information, because banking was set up for poor and miserable or needy persons. That always makes me smile because, you know, banks, as we all know, banks these days, um, they like it if you've got a lot of money to invest, not necessarily to be poor, miserable, and needy. But yeah, I do sort of smile at that. I mean, banking has changed, right? I'm sort of moving a slight tax here in terms of understanding, making that connection between what I've alluded to as responsible banking. And banking is a challenge. I mean, it's to run a bank these days, you need a huge amount of regulatory and compliance. You've obviously technology and data. I mean, our technology has moved fundamentally. The risk profiles have changed. I had a couple of questions about 2 or 3 weeks ago, where people are saying, you know, with COVID-19, all these loans that have been made, you know, how does that impact the credit profile of organizations and individuals? And I said, well, time will tell, because we're still in it. Fundamental change. So risk profiling, and of course talent aspect, and that's really important, is to be able to retain talent. You tend to find in banking industry there's quite a high level of turnover. It just is fundamental in terms of people wanting to, you know, to maximize that financial gain. So customer retention and mobile experiences, of course, security breaches. I mean, it doesn't go past a day that we haven't seen that. Just sort of alluding to how, you know, how that has changed over time. And then just connecting with that initial point that I made, simplification is the issue. And I think it's trying to simplify the industry so that people understand day to day. And you want to do the same with ESG and sustainability. You want to simplify the understanding of what we need to do and what we need to achieve so that people have a better understanding. People always ask me when I go into a program or a project, and they say, where do I start? I said, hold. Start by talking to the people that do the job absolutely every single day of their lives. Have a talk to the people on the ground that are doing what you need to change every single day. And then have a conversation like we're having here with them. Get that good understanding, because that's where you start. Don't start at the top talking to the managing or CEO, because he's quite a long way, you know, his strategy, and he's quite a long way from it. So start at the bottom and go and work to the top. And that's me being called the silver fox in at Barclays. But you do see the flag there, right? Because as a South African, and Sharon, you'll appreciate this, wine is quite an important part of the South African lifestyle. You know, the Western Cape and Stellenbosch and Franschhoek, we produce some of the best wines in the world, but there are better ways of producing wine. I mean, the agricultural sector is quite a big polluter, methane, etc., etc. So there's quite a lot going on there. But that was me. That was my parting gift from a very
wonderful,
a very talented artist who actually didn't really. He was quite quiet, and he was one of those just got on with the job. But they presented this to me on my last day with my parting gift. It was actually really nice. So I didn't take all my clothes off at the Christmas party just to
I did look at that thinking that's interesting.
Dispel that. But I mean, I think what really what I want to bring out is what needs to be fixed. I think is the element. I mean, it's been really great to get the questions on sustainability and ESG, but for me, again alluded to earlier, is that culture of change and diversity. We need to embrace that. We need to walk that talk, I think, is the important thing. I mean, it's quite a cliche these days, but really being able to put actions, against the words that we talk about. The customer first, of course, I think is always people over profit, as I've alluded to earlier. Collaboration and innovation. We have to find different ways of doing things. We talked about technology. We talked about the way that we produce energy, etc. Clean water. We really need to think about how we can do it innovatively and successfully. A core strategy, as again for me, I get up every morning, and for me it's purpose, pride, and passion. Without those fundamentals, I think there's quite a lot missing. Data breaches, and I hate to sort of bring it down to that, but there's quite a lot of that going on nowadays. You tend to find that people kind of dispel the fact that we've made a mistake and so sorry and then move on. But for me, I think you need to go a step further. You need to make people more responsible and accountable. I think that big stick approach is definitely a requirement. And appreciation of loyalty. we are humans after all. So, it's really bringing that social aspect in, treating humans like humans, moving away from the profit, profit totally, and making, people the fundamental of your organization, and cohesion and coordination. And I'll put that in bold because, wherever I go, it's one person or one department or one organization doing something completely different. And you'd actually think if it's part of one organization, they should all be pulling in the right direction, but they just don't. So it's bringing that to the fore. And I think that that's really the important piece to pull out.
I think your points are extremely pertinent because they actually are. I can now understand what it is you want me to do. The period we have just been through, 12 months in the case of the UK and South Africa, where we've had to deal with COVID. How has that crisis that the world has had to deal with, and how we have, as boards, had to pull together, step up, meet every week, start making radical decisions with very little information, and most importantly, have had to focus on a stakeholder group, their staff, in a way that they probably have never done before. And you talked about the customer first in that one. That's one of your stakeholders. You didn't talk about the the staff welfare, or the staff themselves, but you did talk about the appreciation of loyalty, which obviously that's all your stakeholders, of which your internal staff are some. In the boards you've worked with, have you seen any? Has this crisis helped boards get to understand some of these things you've talked about of the customer first, appreciation of loyalty, cohesion? Has it helped?
Very much so. I think that the first response there is that organizations have suddenly realized that good, well structured, good infrastructures actually are fundamental. Some of the operational side of things. I mean, customer service centers. My financial advisor works in an office, but they've actually moved into a museum, of all places, because the Wi-Fi connection is fantastic, whatever. So I think organizations have come to some realization that having that plan B is fundamental. To be put into a situation where you're moving staff out of the environment where it's normally face to face. For me, I'm quite a prominent of that face to face, because I think the social aspect of a working environment is quite important, very important actually. Having a chat around the coffee machine is as important as pushing buttons on a computer and making things happen. I think organizations have had to realize that operational resilience aspect is a lot more important to take into consideration. In fact, legislation is coming out this year in the banking sector of widening the resilience aspect.
Correct.
Not so much just how much you've got on the balance sheet, which happened after the financial crisis, but actually, does the coffee machine still work in an environment where the power goes off? That kind of thing. I mean, I use that as examples, but very important to realize that your plan B is actually as important and needs to be operational as much as plan A.
Yes, and it's the physical. I think we always talked about having the off-site backup plan. Well, all you do is pick up your handbag, your briefcase, your backpack, and head home. We've got a couple of questions coming through, so I just want to pick up the first one. You did refer to Bill Gates' book a moment ago. Is the title How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, or was it another one that you made reference to?
That is the correct title.
That is the correct one. Okay, so for those of you who wanted to know, it's How to Avoid a Climate Disaster by Bill Gates. So thanks very much for that one.
If you want to get it, it's Amazon at the moment. There's a small discount. I think it's just that was launched on the 16th of February. So to get about a £5 off it, Amazon, and it arrive in a day or so.
Another question we've got: what evidence are you seeing of changing business models within banks to encourage wholesale business that meets the new ESG requirements? For example, the application of ESG criteria in the pricing up and the capital usage of such transactions.
I think that's a fantastic question. I think is the biggest chat, and again, I'll answer that with a challenge response, because it is relatively early days, but trying to measure the social impacts and trying to measure social value and social awareness is always going to be a bit of a challenge, because what is valuable to some might not be as valuable to others. So you need to strike a balance between how you measure the S part. The environment part, I think, is fairly is evident. We do see it a lot in the newspapers and the headlines, etc., etc. But again, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to get down to understanding how that measurement takes place. Sharon, you asked me about data earlier, and it's just not, whether the data is there or not is one question, but it's also how people use that data and to make a decision or a change in the environment, and that's where we're struggling actually, because we just don't have that cohesive data set that is required. You've got to measure yourself against a benchmark and some sort of scale. Putting a benchmark and a scale to a social element and to the talent aspect or whatever is a challenge.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I sense in conversations with people on this subject is, because we are in a life of immediacy, we expect everything to actually have a result before we've even started, kind of thing. Our concentration spans are that of a gnat these days. And I think the ESG element it's a long fuse. It's not a tomorrow solution, but the fuse will blow up if it reaches the wrong point. So it's finding that balance that you're not going to get an immediate result. You have to retain or continue to do the right thing so that you get to the right outcome in the long term. One of the other questions is around Eskom and Eskom's total reliance at this point on non-clean energy, on the coal-fired power stations and the old power plants that they've got. If you think of where Eskom is now, what could they do with your strategic ESG hat on that would change the power problems in South Africa?
What a question! Absolutely, and thank you for the person that asked that, because absolutely fantastic. I mean, I've seen the impact of that, where as we know, just for people that are not familiar with load shedding in South Africa, you tend to find it's like anything, right? We expect, as you mentioned earlier, we expect power to be on all the time. It's kind of an expectation. You turn the light doesn't come on. You kind of look up, see whether your neighbour's lights are still on, that kind of thing. But power in South Africa has become a very hot topic, political issue, of course, because Eskom is a state-owned quasi-state. There's an element of but it's a para-state, right? So it's a state-owned organisation. There is, people point fingers and make noises about lack of maintenance, etc., and not looking ahead. And again, it's building new power facilities take time. Mm-hmm. But where there is a complete lack is the fact that South Africa actually is rich in so many natural resources. We have one or two dams that are quite important. In fact, the one that's in Cape Town uses a gravity system. It pumps water to the top of a hill, in effect at night, and then during the day, when the power requirements are higher, it actually uses gravity to push it through a hydroelectric system just outside Cape Town. Actually, my father was involved in that when he was working for General Electric Company, and building infrastructure. So where I think South Africa needs to look is looking at the natural resources for a start. It's only going to give about 8 or 10% in the immediacy, right? It's not something that's really going to solve the bigger problem. Rather controversially, there are nuclear options. That is a little bit more challenging, but again, can be brought on for solving the big problem. But it's also beginning to make let's say organizations realize that investment in coal, and we're still doing it, right? We're still there because it's cheap, it's available, as what we've been doing.
It's also what we know, as you said, it's what we know. We default to where we are currently. You talked earlier about all the regulatory aspects in the banking side. We stepped away from banking for a moment into the Eskom and the electricity and the green aspect of electricity generation. There must be an ESG positive if government and private sector and SMEs could all come together with a regulatory oversight and allow participation into the grids of countries, South Africa being one. I mean, the ability to, from our household environments, is to create that clean energy back into the system. Then surely you'd be at more than something like 8-9%.
And certainly, but I mean, I look at it from slightly the other side, and I say, what we need to be doing is we need to be overall as a nation using less, because actually, if we think about it, we need to change that thinking within individuals. And in fact, it's a very unique situation, because as an organization that's trying to maximize usage, you've got Eskom, putting out adverts saying, people, please don't turn the electricity on because we don't have the capacity. It's like me saying, well, please don't contact me because I don't want to give you some consulting services. I mean, that would be quite unusual, but people need to change their behaviors and their choices. I mean, you're not going to solve the problem by putting up massive wind farms and building hydroelectric. It's going to take time, it's going to take investment, and it's going to take that incentive for government, as you say, to come together. Always a challenge, right? When you've got a number of people that need to have that sort of cohesive thinking, and we need to attack it from all sides. And for those that get into the first couple of pages of Bill Gates' book, he's quite and I don't get any commission out of his book, but he does allude to the fact that people need to use less. We need to find better ways of doing things. We're technologically quite astute. As I said, it's shown that in many cases, and we need to find ways of doing things that are not as intensive as putting emissions into the atmosphere. So it's not just going to take one thing of building more infrastructure. It's going to take collaborative efforts of people's behaviours changing, investing in areas that we know the country has natural resources. We've got a massive solar farm development in South Africa, which somewhere in Sunderland is quite well known, actually, but further north in Sunderland.
Oldest part in the country in winter.
Exactly. But with the technology today, you don't need continuous sun, right? It's more driven by light these days. In the old days, you needed quite a bright sun to get the power into the grid to make it viable. These days, you can have a solar panel on your roof in the United Kingdom, and we don't, the sun's a bit challenging sometimes, but we need to change people's behaviours and how we do things, as much as creating bigger and more infrastructure.
And that takes me to one of the questions. It's a really, really basic question, but really important. If this has not been a world that we have experienced up until now, whether I'm on the shop floor in an organization or in a manufacturing plant, or whether I'm the chairman of the board of an organization, where do I start learning about the importance of ESG? How can I personally do something that's going to make a difference? Where would you recommend people go out and start?
I mean, it's a fantastic question. Thank you. That's luckily I get asked that question quite a lot. So, I mean, for me, a starting point, there's a huge amount of information out there, and so one needs to. I think the best thing is to internet resources, etc. Use some of the information sources quite responsibly in terms of their responsible approach. They get a good view of what the market is doing. Looking at even reading some parts of an annual statement and the CSR report. I'm not saying read 350 pages because that might be a challenge for most of us. But get an understanding of the way that organisations are thinking, because you don't need to read too much between the lines to see where organisations are going in terms of their thinking. Get involved in some of the pressure groups. There's quite a lot there. I'm not advocating a Greta Thunberg type approach, because that does have its uses, and we can have another discussion offline on that one. But I think get involved in some of the areas. I think locally and community-based groups are very, very very supportive in terms of getting involved. If you don't get people involved at a very young age, you're not going to have that longevity, as we've spoken about earlier. So I think the resource, combination of resources, understanding what organizations are doing, seeing how people are making changes, obviously keeping abreast of the news and the challenges around, some of the negative aspects, because it gives you a broad view, so that you can actually, form quite a wide range of opinion, and then talk to me, right? I don't mind doing any chats, I don't mind at all, right?
Thank you.
I actually love sharing the passion because it's quite important to me.
Another book that's been recommended by one of our attendees is The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. Don't know if you know that, but it's been recommended by one of our team as a book worth reading at the same time. I was going to ask you a question, of course, it's gone straight out of my mind at that moment in time. We are coming up for the end. Is there just a last shared statement you'd like to give, John? Something that will leave us wanting more and doing something different? And when we come off this call, that we don't say, well, that was interesting, and go back to doing exactly what we were doing before. What are we going to do differently?
I think it's fantastic, Sharon. And again, thank you for the for the opportunity to share the passion. I think the important thing is get it down to basics, understand the impact of what we do. Now that doesn't mean stop driving your diesel motor car and doing all these sorts of things, but I think the next time you turn the kettle on to make a cup of tea, which is quite a lot in this country on a daily basis, or coffee or whatever, understand that has a complete value chain requirement to get it through the system. And really, it's I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying think about how that could be done differently and more cleanly, less carbonized in the future. It's really just getting that behavioral change, I think, to me is the.
So we're going to boil 1 cup of water, not a litre, for my 1 cup.
Very much so.
I can't think of any other way of doing it.
But we'll drink less coffee. But I mean, I think the important thing is that it's the fundamental things that we do on a day-to-day basis that, because we see them as the norm, we don't really think about them. And for me, I think the important thing is to just have that glass of wine, as we often do in South Africa and all over the world. Is to just simplify that whole process on just the things that we treat as the norm, so to speak.
Right, we've got a couple of thank yous, and from our side as well, but just for the rest, those who have attended so far, and those that are, some more books, that's interesting. The other ones in the series are all going to be approaching it from very, very, very different angles, because as John has alluded to us very clearly today, there isn't one lens on ESG. There isn't one way we're going to solve it. Not one industry will approach it in the same way. It is a fundamental part of the way we're going to be doing business, but equally interesting enough, it's a fundamental way about the way we as humans are going to think about our planet and our wastage mentality that we've had for a good number of decades. So John, thank you for bringing us back to ground, the one that we're going to look after, and giving us a reason to think differently going forward so that we don't put strain on our environment in the way that we are currently doing. And very interesting talk. We've had a couple of thank yous for your valuable knowledge. What I appreciated is that we got some practical and we got some strategic, but we didn't get a textbook thrown at us. So thank you so much for not doing that part of it. And anybody who wants to make contact with John, his contact details are there. We will put them into the follow-up email as well, so that you can contact him directly. And there's some other ideas of some sources. It's not the same one. Sources of reading matter that you can follow up on. And if anybody has a specific angle of ESG that you would like us to approach or that you would like to understand more about, please give us a call, because it will help us to frame the sessions and the frequency, a number of them, between now and leading up into COP26 in November. So John, and those who we can't see, thank you very much. Really
Absolutely
appreciate
fantastic.
your time.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you.
Thanks. And we're 3 minutes late. That is awful. Sorry, guys, I don't normally do that, but we thank you, John. Really appreciate it.
Good then.
And goodbye to everybody.